Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Designing Black Spaces with Community Accountability, the latest event in our Winter 2023 public programming series. My name is Anne-Marie Armstrong, and I am an assistant professor teaching stream at John H. Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design. On behalf of the Daniels faculty and our dean, who is joining us via streaming this evening, we want to heartily welcome you to this event and thank you for coming here tonight to join us in and to engage in an important discussion about Black community engagement. Alongside, of course, our very esteemed guests, Jessica Kirk, Tura Wilson, and Jessica Hines. Thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. We acknowledge all treaty peoples, including those who came here as settlers, as migrants, either in this generation or in generations past, and those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly those brought to these lands as a result of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. We pay tribute to those ancestors of African origin and descent. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people and people of African descent from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Before we introduce our speakers, we would like to invite our special guest, Greg Birkett, to the stage to perform a spoken word piece. Greg Birkett is a poet and playwright who has written two phenomenal plays, Do You Remember and Pieces of a Black Woman's Soul, which were performed at the Toronto Fringe Festival, Toronto's largest theater and performance festival, and for sold-out audiences at the Sandbox Theatre in downtown Toronto, respectively. Please join me in welcoming Greg Birkett to the stage. Yeah. Thank you, Greg. Yeah.
So this piece is entitled Falling Walls, and while we are at an event celebrating architecture, and it might seem strange that I'm talking about walls falling down, hopefully by the end of this piece you'll understand where I'm coming from. Falling walls. What are walls? What do walls represent? What do walls prevent? What is a wall's or a wall maker's intent? Small walls or great estate walls made of cement meant to protect heads of states, kings, queens, prime ministers, and presidents. It's evident that walls are erected to keep the unwanted or the rejected on the periphery, to keep the valued safe, or to keep the location of valuables a mystery. The history of walls for people who look like me is easily discouraging. But the paintbrush of perspective held in the hands of the resilient can create scenes that are encouraging. Picture us thinking outside of the walls in magnificent ancient civilizations, Mali, Kush, Ghana, Songhay, Egypt, Aksum, kingdoms of agriculture and gold featuring bold leaders and complex artistic and architectural creations. Look at us climbing over the walls built by expressions of oppression that lasted for centuries, transatlantic tragedies, auctions, and unspeakable violence that still impact our physical and our mental capacities. We were strong and mighty. We led small and large-scale rebellions, used unrivaled intelligence to plan escape routes woven into our hair or hidden in our songs. We fought and won our independence in Haiti, the children of Ibus and Ashantis defending maroon villages led by the likes of Cudjoe and Grandi Nani. Watch us hurdling the walls of state-sanctioned violence from Sharpeville to Selma, going toe-to-toe with the twin terrorists, apartheid and Jim Crow. Rallies, protests, marches, and sit-ins all over the world, Birmingham, Greensboro, Notting Hill, and Dresden in Ontario. Frank Critchlow, Viola, Desmond, Rosa, Angela, the university campus in Mona, Walter Rodney to Rocky Jones in Nova Scotia. We sang, marched, sat, endured beatings and telephone wiretaps, and never gave in or rolled over. See us scaling the walls of injustice that threaten to keep us on the margins of society, taking it to the streets in the names of those deceased due to law enforcement's brutality, fighting for change, saying their names, giving our all to ensure that they didn't die in vain. Essentially, what I'm saying is with a history this rich, we cannot allow the walls of ignorance, walls of jealousy, walls of complacency, walls of hypocrisy, self-hate, greed, and disunity to cripple, confine, or destroy our communities. I am my brother's keeper. I am my sister's partner and co-leader. So let us draft, design, and build together as we endeavor to create constructions that function as spaces where we can meet, speak, teach, strategize to defeat systemic anti-Black racist cliques or simply seek shelter. Walls that historically divided Black families, units, youth, and elders were built on faulty foundations that cannot last forever. Clever and industrious, artistic with an illustrious narrative, the children of warriors, everyday civilians, empresses, and emperors. This is us. So my people, hear my passionate plea in conjunction with my compassionate call to stand side by side like a human wrecking ball, unified to make sure that prejudice, discrimination, microaggressions, and other forms of oppression are nothing more than tumbling, crumbling, falling walls.
Thank you, Greg, for that incredibly powerful performance. Thank you so much. Our discussion on designing Black spaces with community accountability will be broken up into 3 parts tonight, where each panelist will answer a question to lead our discussion. First, we will begin with Jessica Kirk. Jessica Kirk is a cultural worker, creative, and organizer based in Toronto. She is the executive director at Wildseed Centre for Art and Activism and a member of Black Lives Matter Canada, both dedicated to supporting Black liberation efforts in Toronto and across Turtle Island. Tonight, she will focus on the question, what does a community accountability framework look like? Following the discussion with Jessica Kirk, we will have Tura Cousin-Wilson present. Tura Cousin-Wilson is a co-founder and principal of the studios of contemporary architecture, SOCA, a Toronto-based practice focused on inclusive city building and beautiful spaces. As an architect, Tura has experience in various scales and types of projects, including housing, cultural spaces, heritage, and urban design. Tura is also a member of BETA, Black Architects and Interior Designers Association, and I'm very proud to be a member with her in this organization. The third presentation will be given by Jessica Hines. Jessica Hines is an acclaimed business psychologist, utilizing her Master of Science in International Business Management and BA in Psychology to assist immigrant and small businesses in the Caribbean and Canada alongside the nonprofit organization Black Urbanism Toronto. So I'd like to really welcome you all today and tonight, and thank you for joining us here at the Daniels faculty. I will now invite Jessica Kirk to the podium to present the first topic. Thanks, Jessica.
How's everybody doing? Great. I don't know how to work this thing, so I'm just going to start tapping until, ooh,
There it goes.
cancel? Cancel.
Cancel that, yeah. Okay. Oh,
Open this. There we go. All right. Okay. All right, so thanks so much for the lovely introduction, and thank you, Greg, for the wonderful piece that you've sort of ground us all in as we start to talk a little bit more about critical design and all of the lovely things surrounding the work that I have sort of the honor and privilege to take up at Wildseed. I also wanted to thank Daniels for organizing such an important discussion, and to Black students in design. I don't know where Clara is right now, but you folks have been doing incredible work to support Black students on campus, so congratulations, and thanks for thinking of us. So today, what I'll be talking about is really just I'm gonna start off by talking about who and what Wildseed actually is, before going into a really brief kind of touch point on the politics of space and why space is so important to the work that we do at Wildseed and BLM Canada. I'll then talk a little bit about the Wildseed renovations and the way that we have engaged with this conversation around community engagement. And then I'll finally sort of finish off my discussion today, or my presentation, with talking about more centrally, like, our commitment to adaptation. So who are we? M4BJ is just kind of a name that we drew from to incorporate ourselves as an organization, but our organization comprises of two sort of main areas of work. We are both Black Lives Matter Canada, as well as Wildseed Centre for Art and Activism, and these are kind of the core pillars under which we take up our local efforts at the Community Hub, as well as our national networks kind of commitments and what sort of drives our work forward. At BLM Canada, again, as I mentioned, it's a national network of grassroots organizers across the country. There are chapters everywhere from Vancouver on the far west coast of the country to Sudbury, Guelph, Ontario, different parts of Ontario. There are folks in Calgary, as well as Newfoundland, and folks along the East Coast as well. So there are roughly 10 chapters at this point that we are connected with through our national network. And at BLM Canada, what we do is that we resource grassroots efforts and activism across the country. We also spearhead a lot of different kinds of research priorities, most primarily obviously the overarching kind of work is anti-Black racism, but we do a lot of police research around police use of force, police budget spendings, and just equip our organizers and activists across the country with the research that's needed to guide the multiplicity of efforts that they take up on the ground. There are some activists in the country who do work around challenging police violence, and a lot of our work kind of centers an abolitionist set of principles. But there are other kind of initiatives in the country where folks kind of do, they take up food justice work. There are a lot of chapters who take up youth engagement as their priorities. There are a lot of different ways that challenging anti-Black racism actually takes place through these local efforts, and BLM Canada is just a hub and a space to offer political education and just grounding tools to make their efforts as easy as possible. And on the other end, there is the Wildseed Centre, which is what you folks may have seen in the first slide, this kind of cute little hub over here at Ross and Cecil Street. It's a multi-floor, 10,000 square foot kind of community center, and our efforts at Wildseed Centre focus on cultural programming and production, as well as space. BLM Canada's staff, as well as Wildseed staff, work out of the center, but the primary kind of focus of Wildseed is, again, a whole host of different kinds of cultural production efforts and services that are offered to both activists and artists, Black activists in Toronto, including a fellowship program for artists, a community garden program that we have started up last year and sort of we're catching our foots and kind of building it out this year, as well as bookable space that's offered to different kinds of multidisciplinary artists, and we really unearth and unpack a more expansive understanding of what art practice actually looks like. So there's a recording studio, a dance studio, a movement room, a child sort of mining space, an open source library, a whole host of different kinds of programming initiatives that we facilitate and that we offer out to community for them to be able to facilitate their own experiments on, building out Black liberation for our community. So that's who we are. Now, what we do is kind of centered around this conversation around the politics of place. And I felt like it would be important, before talking about community engagement or I didn't write down the questions specifically, and so, but before we kind of ground ourselves with like the overarching question around how community engagement works, I felt like it would be super helpful to contextualize the approach, why we approach the work that we do and the way that we do. And I don't really have the time necessarily to talk through what the Haitian Revolution was and who the Black Panther Party was and what they did, but kind of the theme here, historically and contemporarily, is that Black people have historically been, space has been disproportionately taken from Black people, and Black people have been stripped away from access to space across time and history. There are many of our ancestors who have been taken from our ancestral homes and forced to build out cities, communities, spaces by the standards and priorities that have been set by people who are not parts of our communities. And the Haitian Revolution, for example, is like a really great way to kind of illustrate all of the ways that our ancestors have pushed back against these colonial understandings of how space needs to look and who gets to decide who has access to what kinds of configurations of space. The Black Panther Party is kind of referenced here as an example to illustrate the ways that different kinds of Black liberation activist initiatives across history have used space as like a grounding anchor to do Black liberation work in a multiplicity of ways. There are different kind of headquarters that Black Panther Party chapters had across Turtle Island, really, like in Chicago, New York, and there are Pan-Africanist movements, like Marcus Garvey is a really great example of that, who had different headquarters across Turtle Island to give activists and also just community members access to space so that they could, so that their lives were just made easier in different kinds of ways. And so Wildseed is connected to a shorter history of Black Lives Matter activism in Toronto and across Canada, but it also follows a much longer and more expansive lineage of pushing back against and resisting, again, these understandings of space and place that were kind of forced on our communities by colonial powers. Contemporarily, though, I think it's also helpful to kind of illustrate the lineage of our sort of organization at Black Lives Matter Canada and Wildseed Centre, respectively, because the founding members of Wildseed Centre and of BLM Canada, the project started out very local in a lot of capacities. Black Lives Matter Toronto was a response to a call to action for support for folks like Jermaine Carby, who were killed by police in 2014 in the Peel region, and Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown, who were also killed by police on the south side of the 49th parallel. And so their efforts in many ways, and I was kind of in the periphery volunteering and showing up to the protests, but a lot of the work that was taken up through those local efforts did center space and place in a lot of really central and important ways. Tent City was a really, really stark and really core example of all of the ways that taking up space within and among community is one of the ways that we can kind of push for and advocate for more livable futures for our communities. How much time do I have? Have you?
I have it, but
Okay.
yeah.
We're just gonna do a solid 5 or 6, 7 more minutes. Great. And so, yeah, the long and short of it is that there's a really strong kind of lineage and context behind the importance of taking up space for Black people, and why Wildseed Centre is such an important manifestation of what we continue to push for, which is livable space for Black people to experiment and design out how liberation could look for our communities. I had an excerpt that I wanted to read, but essentially it was kind of just like a list of the demands that were put forward at Pride, which was a really important sort of protest that was held at Pride Toronto in 2016. In essence, a lot of the demands that were put forward in that initiative were centered around a whole different host of spaces that had been slowly chipped away at and taken away from Black, queer, and trans communities within Toronto, and a call to action to give back the spaces that had been taken away. The demands were also kind of carved out through consistent and really diligent consultations and conversations with Black, queer, and trans grassroots groups and efforts across the city. And I think that that's a really great kind of benchmark that us as now a national organization has set to continue to kind of meet those standards around prioritizing collaborative design while advocating for different conditions for our communities. So it isn't as though on BLM Toronto side, it's not as though they kind of just gathered 5 people in a room and decided this is how we're going to move forward. It required really extensive, sometimes frustrating, always important conversations with community around what their priorities actually were. So now on to Wildseed Centre, and I am really upset at myself for not timing myself, but I'm gonna try to just be as clear and concise as possible. But yeah, the Wildseed Centre is a product of those legacies and the more shorter sort of 5 or 6 year history of approaching Black liberation efforts in the ways that we have. The project priorities for the renovations of the home, the community hub that I had been speaking about, were to kind of center accessibility, to center sustainability, to engage in different kinds of public art activations and opportunities, economic development, and by that I mean equitable economic development and opportunities for communities. So things like ensuring that the contracting company that we hired was Black owned, ensuring that the architects that we hired was a Black-led architectural firm, the planners that are involved, ensuring that they're also Black, just again, dialing it back to the communities that our organization is meant to serve. And basically everybody in between, everybody who's kind of central and core to the project that we're undertaking at the center is a Black-owned company. And then finally, community engagements, just making sure that the architects who we sort of engaged with understood that community engagement is kind of core to this work, and collaborating with them around designing consistent activations to engage with community was really important to the starting point of the renovations that we've taken up. So now onto the community engagement kind of principles. The different kind of activations that we have hosted with community have been, they've been taken up in a whole host of ways. There were informal conversations that we had with community. There were more formalized kind of tours that we had hosted when the space was first purchased. And there were also really concretely designed community engagement, like town halls and activations and sort of workshops. And they kind of tied back to these 3 central pillars. Intuition was a really core conversation that we had, and the way that we were framing this conversation around intuition was thinking really intentionally about how people feel in the space, and how they imagine using it. The second is around safety, recognizing that Wildseed Centre is like an activist hub, and so as a community who is not only used to being like hyper surveilled, but also recognizes that Black people do have disproportionate experiences of being followed and watched and, not believed or trusted. Safety was really, really important, a really important conversation to have with community. And so we asked, is there anything that you would change to feel safer? Lastly, the conversation around adaptation was really, really central. Most specifically, do you feel that there's anything that you would change to better connect with the space? What can be added? And I kind of say all of this to say that what we have committed ourselves to at Wildseed is just recognizing that we should invite an openness and sort of commit ourselves to an openness to adaptation, recognizing that nothing is finite within the space. This renovation project is one project, and things can and will continue to change and adapt within the space. So Octavia Butler inspired the name of the center. Wildseed is a name of one of her books, and this is like a really grounding quote that I often return to, which really speaks to sort of the power of having, that grounding commitment to adaptation and change. I guess I'll leave it. I will read it out, actually, just in case interpretation requires it. It says, "All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change." Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you so much. The format essentially is we'll have 3 presentations, and interspersed amongst that is an opportunity for the audience to also engage with the speakers and with the subject matter. And I'd love to start by potentially opening it up to any audience members or friends, faculty joining us today, students that might have any questions or want to expand upon the idea of community accountability frameworks. I could also open it up to the panelists, of course. Would love to hear your thoughts as well. But if there's any anyone interested in speaking or sharing some experiences, we would welcome that. Okay, so Jessica, maybe I could pass it to you. I think the framework that Jessica Kirk has sort of brought forth in terms of equity, intuition, safety, and adaptation, is that, would you say in your experience, would you expand upon that with other kind of themes or concepts, or is that in line with your approach as well when working with community groups?
It's my mic. Oh, it is?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's great.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I will be touching on like a few other stuff that she has touched on in terms of engaging with community. I really liked when she said about intuition, because, and I guess I'll also go into my presentation too at this point, but when we're dealing with community, there is trauma, and sometimes we don't want to reactivate that trauma, and sometimes we have to start first and understand where are they coming from. And then once we understand where they're coming from, and collectively, hopefully, healing is an ongoing process as well. And but once the community understands that it's ongoing, once we understand that it's ongoing, and there's that collective understanding that this is what we need to move forward as a group, then I think we can activate a collective intuition, and then we can do move forward. So I really liked when she said that about intuition, because I think sometimes when we approach things, it's really head focused, and sometimes it's okay to look in our hearts, look at what do you really feel that really needs to change, and even needs to stay in a community, because we don't always need to change things. Maybe we just might need to alter something, just so that it's adaptable for whatever is like the contemporary like need. So.
And would you say that that conversation is very much rooted in a sort of spatial experience, in the sense that it's rooted in place and in space, those conversations, but I guess, it's also experiences that are in places, so they're tied together, and I just wonder, does the sort of, how those conversations go?
Yeah, it's like, sorry, just gonna
Yeah.
add. Yeah, it's like kind of like organic, and then
Yes.
it's also like you'll need like physical spaces, right,
Yes.
to have these conversations. So with Budo and like the work that we do, most of our conversations are happening like in the barbershops or in the salon, right? But yet we open it up to the community to tell them like, hey, like we have a physical space now, so you can come and speak with us. And also just being available, like, well, now that we have technology, shoot us like an email, or we can have like a Zoom conversation. But yeah, just really, it comes back to like meeting people where they're at, seeing where they're comfortable. And yeah, because not all the time someone can physically go into a space, right? Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I don't know, Tura, you have anything to expand on there, or we can...
Yeah, I can chime in.
Yeah.
Excuse me. I think working both with Budo and Wildseed and Black Lives Matter Canada, interesting thing from an architect perspective, and I imagine there's a lot of architects here, so much of these questions aren't in a typical practice setting. So it's a lot of, it's great to see it's kind of driven by people, activism outside of the profession of architecture that in many ways is pushing architecture in a direction that more architecture should be going. So, it's nice to see, and I think a critical thing is it's kind of the community and accountability. So we're not just talking about black spaces, we're talking about accountable black spaces. And I think that's critical in the sense, with working with Jess and Wildseed, it's pushing limits on, sustainability, climate justice, inclusivity and justice around, gender, identity, and expression, as well as an inclusive arts hub. So, barrier-free accessibility. So it's much, and I think that accountability and really driven from community, which I think is what makes it impactful.
Yeah. And so it's sort of under, let's say, an ethos of design justice in some sense, would you say? That
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing of, working both with Budo and Wildseed is design justice driven not by, say, a code requirement or a zoning requirement, really by clients, for me, that have a really strong mandate and ethos of what they want a space to be, and as an architect, how to interpret that into architecture.
Yeah, because the project is like, the project, it's built out by like a solid core set of principles that we have held dear to us since the very beginning. So I feel like collaborating from a starting point of those principles, of a commitment to disability justice, to Black liberation, to abolitionist principles, was a really great way of kind of engaging more intentionally with conversations around safety, around pushing back against surveillance, for example, in really concrete and tangible ways. So,
great. Thank you. Great. So I guess we could move on to Tura next. So now we will invite Tura to the podium to share his thoughts on practices of engaging community needs through the design process. So it's a nice extension, I think, from the previous conversation.
Escape?
Yeah, I think the tech should be able to change this.
Oh, here we go. Oh. All right. Hello, everybody. Who is the hi? The lone hi. My name's Tura. co-founder and principal of SOCA, Studio of Contemporary Architecture, an acronym but also double meaning. Both myself and studio partner Shane Laptis have roots in the Caribbean. So we wanted to, have an architecture firm that addressed contemporary issues and concerns, but also had a little bit of flavor. We'll speak briefly about work outside of our architectural practice, Beta, which Anne-Marie, myself, Shane, and a few others are founders of, Black Architects and Interior Designers Association. And it started as a grouping of kind of getting to know each other, and gradually turned into a group of networking, advocacy, mentorship, and outreach. So some of the things that we do as a group are mentorship, so things like portfolio reviews. It's mentorship for amongst ourselves, things like, whether if it's like, we're practitioners asking questions about, running a practice, if you're looking to hiring somebody, or questions about dealing with a client or a contract, as well as mentorship towards students at various stages, so high school students looking to get into a career in architecture, students already studying architecture, they might be in between undergrad and graduate, looking for work, looking for advice on a portfolio review, or sometimes it's a reference letter. And then, as well as mentoring students who might be outside the country, looking to get maybe questions on getting their degree certified, or what working in Canada might be like. And then advocacy, advocating in particular for Black architects in Canada. And then outreach, so it's things like community events, gatherings, and just holding fun dinners, which COVID has kind of slowed down, but we've got to do another one soon. And an example, Francis Carey was in town at the IDS show. Was this last year? Yeah, I think it was. Time's flying. So having breakfast with other Black architects, in this case, Pritzker Prize winner, so quite notable architect. And I'll jump into a project that Jess was just speaking about, so the Wildseed Centre for Art and Activism. And I think Jess gave a really good background of how it came to be, the building. Our role as architects is then interpreting that space. And the project right now is broken up into phases. So the phase 1 is under construction, and phase 2 is still in planning. And I'll speak to both briefly. So touching on where Jessica left off, thinking of, what is a Black space, or questions, what is a Black space in a Victorian era home in Toronto that's now a community center, and thinking of things of accessibility, identity, and beauty. One of the things we've been really focusing on as part of the Phase 1 project is a new entrance. Adding an accessible ramp, as you can see here, and then it brings you up to an existing landing, and we're working right through the idea of an entrance that's inviting for not just the Black community, but also the broader community. And this building is just east of Chinatown and south of College, just east of Spadina. Can't really see, you can see it better here. In phase 2 of this project is looking at an expansion to an addition to the back, And then thinking about things of space, of community space, so likely looking at either a black box or multi-purpose performance theater, which would be part of an addition. Still, a lot of this stuff is still in progress, still thinking through. Community arts hubs, green roof, terrace, again, which kind of speaks to some of the community programs that Wildseed has been working on. And then the other element, and this is a basic diagram, it's kind of confusing. So it's a building, the original building was burnt down in the 1980s, but it was rebuilt in the same Victorian style. And we're seeking Passive House certification. It's a bit tricky because we're doing the project in phases, but adds another layer of complexity in the design, but also, I think, intrigue in how we approach, getting a Passive House certified building in an existing building. So there's challenges with that, but I think speaks to some of the dimensions of it, what Jessica was speaking to about, it being much more than just a black space. So, a space that there's accountability to the environment and environmental justice. Another project we worked on, and not from a design perspective, and I think I saw, yeah, there's Chris right there. Everyone, this guy here, really cool dude. Chris Wilson, we share the same last name, so of course he's a cool dude. A project that he and Saeed started, and they've been throwing, correct me if I'm wrong later, they've been throwing parties around in the city and doing a really amazing work. And this building here was purchased by the city, and it's slated to be demolished and turned into a park, and then it's part of a larger redevelopment. So this is on Queen Street, right at Augusta, so just west of Spadina, if you're familiar with that part of the city. And the amazing work that Chris is doing with It's Okay Studios is creating event spaces in the city. And we really hope that something like this becomes a model. And they got a really good deal on a lease from the city. It's temporary. Hopefully that's not the case, and there's longevity to it, whether if it's this building or another facility. And I think to date, the show that I saw, Jamal's album launch party there was really great. And I think to speak to, our role as architects was really not from this perspective, not a design perspective. We, very little contribution from design, but to assist with the permitting and occupancy requirements. And I would suggest to anyone to check this space out. It's tons of different events happening. And you can talk to Chris afterwards. He can tell you a lot more. Speaking to another project, and this was with BUDO, Black Urbanism Toronto, and OACC, Open Architecture Collaborative. We worked on a report back in just before the pandemic is when we completed this. So end of 2019, early 2020. And it was a Black business conversation on Eglinton West. And it started with the amazing work of BUDO speaking to residents, in particular business owners along Eglinton in Little Jamaica. For those of you who are not familiar, it's the stretch of Eglinton. Primary hub is between from Marley over to Dufferin on Eglinton West. And speaking to residents about the issues that they have been facing with gentrification, there's a new transit line, so construction. And they went door to door, understanding that a lot of times conversations like this can be very challenging when talking about equity or accountability for people who, say, have families, don't live nearby, and to get their opinions on what was happening, which also included in-person meetings at one of the restaurants, forgetting the name of it, and speaking to residents. And I think back to the accountability, I think, a lot of the work that we do is within, our community, in the Black community. But it's, we had to, it wasn't an open door necessarily for residents. A lot of people thought, we were with the city and we had big plans on demolishing things, or we were, representing Metrolinx, which is working on the light rail transit line. So, part of the work in community engagement was, building bridges with community residents. And our report was, analyzing things, particularly, the gentrification that had gone by over a decade. So you can see, might not be super legible. It's a little more legible there. The this figure ground diagram represents the change in Black-owned and Caribbean-owned businesses over the period that the LRT had been constructed. And it was identifying things, I think, challenging as an architect. I know what it's like in school. There's sort of these things that, architects can solve all the problems in the world. A lot of the issues are very much non-architectural. So there was, construction debris, which had gone on well over a decade, loss in foot traffic, loss in street parking, things that had really severe impact on business owners who rely on pedestrians and people coming to the neighborhood. Gradual gentrification over the years, less people living in a community, less people walking in the community, more people requiring, if you're not living in the community, then you're taking transit or driving to Little Jamaica to get there to do business. And if transit and traffic are difficult, then, there's in turn less business. And then the triple whammy was COVID-19, which was the kind of the third slap to a lot of the businesses. I think a lot of businesses in this, all around the city are familiar with. So it was identifying these issues, and not so much necessarily trying to find a design solution particularly for them, but to acknowledge them. And I think this actually is really helpful, is working collaboratively with not just architects, but groups like Budo, who have a foot in multiple doors, who are speaking with counselors, who are speaking with businesses and other organizations to in turn try to affect change. And some of the work that OAC and then SOCA was doing was analyzing what made, from an architectural and programmatic building fabric, what made Little Jamaica the quality that was. Where was this being lost? Was it being lost? And the report's on our website. One of the key things from an architectural perspective that we questioned was the approach to density, where in Toronto we have an approach to density that densifies the avenues while leaving the neighborhoods behind that are typically single-family residential the same. And it was questioning, is that the best approach for preserving the cultural and character along Eglinton West and Little Jamaica? And it's questioning, are there other approaches to density that allow for the continuation of businesses? And we created this very speculative image, and I think it's been shared a lot. And it was, looking at a future image without any clear definition of what Little Jamaica is or could be, but to question possibilities of, what's possible for a Black neighborhood, a Jamaican neighborhood, acknowledging that, the purpose is not to try to turn Little Jamaica or similar communities like it into a museum. It's not to say hold it on a mantelpiece and to say this is Little Jamaica from a specific era that we want to keep, but it's to question, how can communities evolve while retaining their own autonomy? And these questions have continued to evolve. Budo's been working with getting a heritage and cultural district designation. Jay Pitter, a placemaker that you may be familiar with, is currently working on it. I think she's almost finished a master plan for Little Jamaica. And this was done after the report. This is a walking tour that Shane and myself led with Jay Pitter around the neighborhood and talking to residents just on the street at the time. All to say that the work has been ongoing and has continued now into our submission for the Venice Biennale. This is just a in-progress image. Ourselves, Budo, and CP Planning, led by Cheryl Case, are contributing to this year's Venice Biennale for Architecture for Canada's submission as part of the submission titled Architects Against Housing Alienation. And Budo and CP Planning have been doing a lot of great work in trying to get a community land trust in Little Jamaica going. Looking at stuff that's been done with Parkdale Land Trust as a model. And both, so I think some of the challenging things we found with working with Little Jamaica and working with these communities is there's not one answer, there's not one solution. There's a multiplicity of issues. So it's looking at not just a land trust for housing, but also a commercial land trust, understanding that businesses need people to live and people need spaces to work and buy and sell from. So I won't get into too much detail on this, all to say that we're working in developing a model for housing and a community commercial land trust in Little Jamaica that's currently in progress, and there'll be more to share. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Tura. Thank you. Love to open it up to the audience again if there are any questions around Tura's work. There's so many exciting projects that you've presented to us, and it's exciting, that there's a collaboration and amongst all the panelists here as well, and in various ways. And overlapping various projects as well, which is really exciting. Are there any questions for Tura? I see one at Clara at the back. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Dane Williams. Great presentation,
Wait,
Tura.
we can't see you, Dane. Right?
I'm sitting down. I'm
okay.
down here.
Hi, boss.
Hi. Great presentation. I do actually have a follow-up question, because a lot of the times, we throw around the word black without acknowledging the diaspora, I always say that wrong, and like the different cultural nuances. So my question to the panel is, how do we take that into consideration as we're doing community consultation work? And I think Jessica had talked about having discussions with community and having difficult discussions with community and landing on kind of one decision. How do we take into consideration the different cultural contexts and nuances in, coming to one selective solution?
So I can start off, actually. If I continue to fiddle with my mic, please forgive me. My ear is like repelling against this little fastening belt. But I think to answer your question, to try to kind of start thinking through your question a little bit more deeply, what is often helpful to remember is that I think that the cultural the multiplicities of Blackness that people sort of walk into conversations with is just one of many identifying markers that people, that invites a sort of fruitful way of approaching design questions or just like critical questions alike, right? Like I come into conversations as a Black woman who is of both Caribbean and African descent. There are Black, queer, and trans people who are involved with the design and sort of the construction of our renovation project at Wildseed, and we also engage with Black deaf artists, Black artists who are hard of hearing, and people who are living with a multiplicity of disabilities. And so I think that number one, like a really important sort of critical thing to remember or ground ourselves with an understanding of is that Afro-diasporic communities are they vary in a million different ways. Like there are a lot of different ways that people show up as a Black person. But my Blackness is different than everybody else around me at this table, not just because of my like cultural differences, but also because of my life experiences. As somebody who might be of a different sort of sexual orientation, gender expression, or gender identity, my abilities are different than all of the people around me, et cetera, et cetera. So welcoming diverse perspectives across the spectrum is like really central to the work that we do. That's one way of thinking about it. I don't know. There are a lot of.
Or Tura, go ahead. Yeah, I didn't know if.
I'll add. So I think it's a really good question because it's a challenge. So I think speaking of with Little Jamaica, so much has been on. Even sometimes people like saying like, why is it Little Jamaica? Why is it not like Little Barbados or like Little Trinidad? So there's those questions, and Little Jamaica is evolving. So it's not just a Caribbean neighborhood. There's Africans there, there's like Filipinos there, and I think for me as an architect, I think it's a question of speaking to what we know. So if Little Jamaica was Little Somalia, and I have like great familiarity with it. Like I grew up not too far from there, just south of there. My barber was there. But I think to what Jess gets at is like there is, I think sometimes like, the Black community gets sort of lumped as this is the Black community, this is this big monolithic, but there's a lot of different identities from like class to gender, different backgrounds. I think stuff that we take on is, working with communities that we know, and if there are things that we don't know, then it's, a different degree of consulting that goes on.
I think the last thing that I'll kind of add to that is what's been helpful for us, not just at Wildseed, but BLM Canada as well, is just grounding ourselves with a commitment to supporting and centering the experiences of those who exist at the margins of the margins. So it's not just about like following the lead of a Black person because a Black person says something, but also just like thinking about Black, queer, and trans, and deaf and disabled, and all of the people who just sort of are pushed to the margins across rooms that where they take up space has been a really sort of helpful grounding anchor for us.
Yeah, there's something about the theme of taking up space too, where as you take up space, it in some way implies multiplicity and multiple people, right? Yeah. You need both community coalitions, some shared experiences, but also conversation and creating, as you say, there's not one solution, Tura, to the design. There's no single design solution in this process. So, and acknowledging that is, I think, part of that process of recognizing the multiplicity in some way, I would say. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, and like I'm thinking as well too, in terms of like the spectrum that exists within like Blackness, because we want to serve everyone, it becomes hard to, I guess give all of your resources to everyone. And so like I always like wonder too, like, is it okay just to start with like one specific group or one specific nationality, like in Little Jamaica, or a sexual orientation? Like, where do we start off with first, and then like if we can, I don't want to say perfect that, but if we can like ensure that community or that specific group is like well equipped, and then we can like support others that way. Because I find like, I don't know how you guys do it, but like it's so hard to like service everyone because like we're just so unique. But yeah.
Just to add to what you're saying, I think one thing too when we're taking on projects is, I know like we framed this conversation around, Black spaces, but at the core, like, you know, my practice is just like a Canadian architecture studio, and, you know, the challenges in, say, Little Jamaica, or designing, you know, inclusive community spaces, you can remove Blackness from it, and there's a lot of just universal issues and opportunities to go at it. So, you know, and I think that's the amazing thing that Budo's been doing, is like learning from, you know, what Parkdale Land Trust is doing, what, you know, Friends of Chinatown have been doing, because everyone's been dealing with things like COVID, and, you know, there's different degrees and there's different nuances, but I think at some of the core, and I think some of the stuff that we take back and are asking ourselves aren't necessarily related to any one specific identity.
Or the practices,
Or the practices, yeah.
the approach in some way could be more open-ended.
Well, and I think there's the opportunity for, you know, back and forth, and finding certain, like, common grounds or similarities or things to feed off of as a designer.
So then how do you find that as like a designer, like those commonalities? Or is that just something that, like, you just, I don't know. Sorry.
Oh
yeah, did we answer your question, Dane? Oh, okay.
I don't know if there is a real answer. It's challenging. One project that's really early, it's not official yet, it is a potential mosque that we might, or it'd be great if we could get it, but, and so I'm not Muslim, but the imam has kind of Caribbean roots. So there's like that connection, and, you know, I did my thesis on a mosque, so there was, you know, from his perspective, there was like a kind of an interest on my perspective, and an understanding, and I think, you know, as architects, especially early on, you know, especially, you know, working with, you know, yourself, is like really trying to listen, because we're experts in the field of architecture, but not in what you do. And I think that's really important as architects, because that can really inform what we can do.
Absolutely. Yeah,
As
that's what I keep
designers, yeah.
thinking of,
And
listening, approaching things in a humble way in some sense, and learning, listening and learning.
And I think, yeah, back to the mosque example, it's to say that, you know, you can learn and you can work with people from different backgrounds, and then there's fun in that too. There's fun in the learning process, and I think we as a studio have tried to have our hands in different scales and different types of projects, because we really enjoy that. But then, yeah, so we're not, and I think it's great to have clients like yourself, where it's like you're experts and also just pushing things, because you have some groups where it's just like follow code minimums, and so there isn't like an immediate push on gender inclusivity or, say, striving for passive house.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So I think I'd love to continue this conversation, but perhaps Jessica Hines, if you'd like to join us at the podium to share your thoughts on how design in community spaces embodies Black flourishing. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Wait, how do I do this part?
They'll be able to control it there, but there should be.
You too.
Oh, no, I don't.
Escape. Let me just.
Oh.
Is yours open?
Yeah, it is. Oh, yeah, I think it's this one. Yep. All right, thank you.
If you want to go full screen.
Oh, it's like school again. Okay. Yeah, thank you. All right. Well, we save the best for last, right? So, hello everyone. My name is Jessica Hines, and I will be talking about how can design in community spaces embody Black flourishing and Black excellence. And so, this topic was really challenging for me, really brought me back to school because I do not come from a design background, but it really gave me an opportunity to like reflect on like my experiences living in Jamaica for like a few years, and it also, and in that reflection, it helped me really think about what it felt like to be in a predominantly Black space, but yet being socialized here in Canada, and like what those what did that even look like? And then secondly, it helped me to reflect on like the work that Budo, as you've been hearing, has doing amazing work in the community, like over the past few years in supporting like Black businesses and residents along Eglinton West. And so just a disclaimer, like I won't be offering any conclusions on this topic, but like I hope to share some like thoughts on design and cultivating this utopic space. So next. All right. So in true academic fashion, I will start off with a quote. So as it reads here, Black people, people of color, poor people have deeply been invested in design, and they have designed, redesigned spaces, not only to create beauty, not just to create money, but to create landscapes that speak to their lives and values, that articulate who they are and why they matter. And so I came across this quote by this associate professor, Rashad Shabazz, in one of the last conversations that U of T hosted in discussions about design. And I think what he suggests here in terms of space, making in terms of space, making can be designed through the ideation of the community. And like I know like this doesn't sound new, because like in history, time and time again, it has shown that like, especially the Black community, even though like we were under-resourced or once, or like just doesn't have like enough, like I said, resources. Once a community, I believe, understands like what its own needs are and what it values, and it can actually trust itself, it has the ability and capabilities of doing so. And so I'm going to share one example of this in my time in Jamaica. So this is, in Kingston, Jamaica, there is this really cool nonprofit organization called Kingston Creative. And just for the context, Kingston, Jamaica is, in theory, is it used to be like a thriving economic hub for the island. And however, in like its downtown core, now like that area has been like riddled with like poverty, extreme like crime rates, and like slum-like conditions. And so organically, what has been happening over the years is that people that have had the resources have left those parts of Kingston and have like moved to what they considered like uptown. And so what this organization has been doing is creating like art spaces in its downtown core to re-invite back businesses to the area and residences to, so that they not only can like bring back their resources and beautify their spaces, but also challenge like the classism that is happening like in Jamaica. So so these are just like a few pictures of downtown Kingston. And so I should note this. Okay. And next I'm just going to talk about like when I was thinking about like other Black spaces in terms of like wealth. The first thing that I thought of was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in terms of its Greenwoods district, and that was like known back in the day as like the Black Wall Street. And so this was like a thriving Black community in the 1920s, which unfortunately got burnt down. The wealth in that neighborhood was like amazing. There were individuals such as a man named like J.W. Thompson, who was like worth over like 500,000, which in today's term would have been, according to Google, like about 6 million. So like there was like communities that existed like this, at least from like an American, and also there are a few examples here in a Canadian context where Black people were able to live, although in segregated communities, but were able to build like their own wealth. And then secondly, I guess on your left or your right, we have a picture here of Wakanda. And so like the media recently has given us like this fictional safe haven for Blacks to like live and do business. But I think what's really interesting about the Wakanda narrative is that they've shown us a unique picture of like, I guess in the design world is like this green city where like there is some sort of like harmony with a thriving community can live in unison and also respect like nature. And also too, in terms of like traditions, just the like nation has like relied on like its elders to support it in like its day-to-day operations. And I think that's important when we're looking at design, that just maintaining that like intergenerational knowledge, sometimes I think it gets lost in a lot of the work that we do. And so, next slide. Yeah, okay, cool. And so within like a Canadian context, I know we've been talking a little bit about Black urbanism and CP planning and about like the work that both groups are doing. And yeah, and I'm just like, the cool thing about both organizations that they're both Black-led, they're both young, and yeah, they're both entrepreneurials, and they're trying to like push the status, not only the status quo, but also do the work that community has been like asking for. So I'll just talk briefly about Budo. And so, so Budo is just like, we're a nonprofit organization that's aimed at strengthening Black communities. Since like 2018 is when we've started out, and one of the co-founders, Dane, is in the audience. And so one of our main mission really is to support the Black community and within Toronto, and just create stronger neighborhoods that we call home. And so over the years, we've just been advocating for Black residences and business owners in Little Jamaica to have like an active voice and role in the redevelopment of the neighborhood. And over the years of like having conversations within the community about like barriers and visions of a future, as well as seeing like, as earlier was brought up, the transit situation, the Black community, as we know, has been losing its like space for not only like having a place of commerce, residence, but also a space for like cultural exchange. And so like to mitigate this and to bring like newer businesses back into the area, we've recently launched this initiative called Pathways to Community Land Ownership, which like Tura was briefly talking about. In terms of, through this initiative, like we just hope to encourage and support property ownership and extend community control among Black businesses in the area. So we hope to achieve that through like a community land trust. And so, so briefly, a community land trust is like a model for community stewardship of land and community assets. And like, I won't have time to go into the details of what that would look like, but the process in general is like designed to like purchase community assets while like enabling stakeholders to exercise their democratic control over community investments and investments decisions. And so what's unique with what we're doing is that, well, I should just put like commercial community land trust, because we really want the community to, that are Black retailers to actually own or have some sort of stake in the buildings that they're doing their businesses in. And so like this model is like popular in the States, and also we're seeing like a resurgence of this happening in Canada. And so we have here like Hogan's Alley in Vancouver, which also was like a Black settlement area back in like the 1850s. And in response to the gentrification and the urban development in the community, they too have like brought their resources together to create a trust in which they will and are actually in the process of acquiring spaces from their city. Yeah, and so Budo really is trying to position itself like Hogan's Alley, like Parkdale, like many other community land trusts, to like, well, for our case, to increase the real estate ownership of the Black community here in Toronto. And then I'm going to briefly talk about like Pardna. So another like organization that is run by Cheryl Clace is also a nonprofit, and their priorities is mostly focused on like affordable housing, jobs in the trades, urban agriculture, and access to community service spaces. So to address the housing situation, the organization is challenging like policies and encouraging all levels of like government that will enable detached and semi-detached homes and add like a long-term like affordable units to these properties. And I kind of found that the name of this initiative to be clever, because it's like a Jamaican term for like community savings. Or it would be Pardna, and like, I don't have a Jamaican accent, guys, sorry about that. But but like in other countries, like that would have been like known as like a susu. And so like the difference here is that this initiative is more so to collaborate with the homeowners to like build the affordable housing on their properties, and that could be, and they don't necessarily have to be like Black per se. And yeah, and according to her website, this model is designed to like help families together and to address issues of racialized people being displaced from their neighborhoods. And as you can see here, the images show single homes that could be repurposed to serve the community. All right, and then next slide. Wait, no, it's not you, it's me. It's my slide. Huh? Oh, okay. All right, and so in doing like all this great work, like where does the community actually get involved in the design process? So, like there's a general saying, I would say, well, that I've come across, in working with community, that like trust is earned and respect is gained through active listening, and that means doing what you said you heard. And I would also add that creating spaces where the community can actually be involved. And like since working for Budo, I would honestly say like I spent like 80% of my time like on the phone with people, whether that's conducting surveys, being on the street. Like I could tell you guys I have lost at least 10 pounds walking from Marley, which is like 10 kilometers, talking with businesses, residents, just about like their needs. But guess what the caveat is, out of all this community engagement, is that they don't want to be asked any more questions, and they don't care about doing any surveys. At the end of the day, they just want to do what we promised in our last report. And so what we have done is to be intentional about involving the community in what we are doing, and we've been doing that in like the following ways. And so for us, right now, that looks like having like 3 of these different things. So one is having like an advisory committee. This advisory committee has been like really instrumental in helping us, well, first of all, know how to engage our like targeted community. And they've like composed of like community activists, residents, and like business owners or people that have like lived in the community. So they have given us like insights on like what is the vision for Little Jamaica as a neighborhood, what could look like the vision for Jamaican businesses and like economic development, and what is actually like the current needs and gaps in the resources that business owners need to like do well. And then we have like a residential and a community activators. So our community activators are really high school students, students that live in the neighborhood. We have like a mini training / we got them into the neighborhoods, having them conduct surveys, even get their friends involved so that there is some sort of continuity because like we really believe in that youth, although are the future, but they also are the present, and so we need to have them engaged in like everything that we're doing like currently. And then there is an active group called the Keel and Eglinton Residents Group. They're very active in the community, and they've like helped us with community organizing and so forth. And then lastly, healing circles. This is something that we are just implementing in terms of having like community deep listening, but as an organization, like we are also implementing having this healing circle done internally first, so that we know we're just like course correcting ourselves to make sure that we are supporting like the community in like the best like way, and we understand too like what our like biases are. So like once like we are like I guess whole, then we can better serve our community. And then and then once we've done that internal work, we would also open that up to the community to engage in these discussions. And yeah, it'll be an ongoing process. So that wraps up my time. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you. Yeah. So I know that we're a bit over our time at this point, and I think our interim conversations and discussions have been so fruitful, and I feel that if there are any pressing questions from the audience, we'd be happy to take 1 or 2. But my suggestion might be that we just sort of continue the conversation as a part of the reception as well, if that works for everyone. So again, just if that's fine, unless there's any hands up.
One question
I see
here.
some hands. Okay, great, perfect. Yes, please. Thank you.
I was at the initial official plan unveiling done by Jay Pitter back in I believe November at the Oakwood Library. That's what got me into sort of this whole urban planning and architecture world. And what I realized as I was asking business owners and community center workers as part of the Black community in both Little Jamaica and the areas facing similar challenges, Weston, Black Creek, etc. When I told them about it, because it was as part of a film I was making for my school about areas in Toronto that the Black community has called home. When I brought that up, it was met with a lot of skepticism, the whole official plan thing. And it sort of goes back to what you guys were saying about how they don't want to be asked any more questions. There's this sort of distrust, right? Because even as Jay is a Black placemaker and working with the Black team and everything, the moment they hear, oh, the city's planning something, they already sense that like skepticism, because it seems like yet another promise, right? So like as you guys sort of make your way through these plans and these community engagement and development consultant things. How do you go about healing and sort of easing that sort of distrust that often gets in the way when it comes to community involvement?
Yeah. Well, one, to be honest, like about what is it that we are, well, there's so many ways to deal with this, but okay, so for one, yeah, just being honest about like what we are actually delivering, because you go into a community and you're like, okay, I'm going to build a road, right? But your intentions really is to survey the road, not to actually build it, but to survey it. And so once you tell community that, yes, your road needs to be fixed, but like the capacity that I actually have is just to survey it, and then I will take this information and let somebody else actually do like the next work. And so I think community needs to understand that there is a process, and understand too, and in order for them to understand that process, there needs to be like a constant communication, and it's always going to be ongoing. Like the thing is with a lot of the work that's being done in any community, like within the city, is that they're all project-based, and they're not like a long-term sustainable program. And unfortunately, these things cost money. And so, as I was saying earlier too, that I think one of the easiest ways is that community should be involved to some degree in that progression of whatever it is that they need to see in their community. Because as long as they are actively involved, then they, and they're a part of the process, then they can then communicate with other people that, hey, this is like a long-term process. Like, don't feel frustrated if you don't see any results in like the next like year and a half, because like I'm actually there. I can see what's happening, because a lot of the times too, community is not in these conversations. They're not here. We're talking about them, but like they're not here to be in these discussions about planning. So there's different ways to answer that question, but I think the easiest way is to have to be transparent, have that communication, let them know that it's ongoing, let them know too what your capacity is, and hopefully that answers your question.
I'll add to that, because it's a good question, and I think skepticism is good, especially when you have these kind of lofty visions and healthy skepticism, as architects. I think a challenge with, talking about Little Jamaica and Eglinton West is, it didn't happen because someone, a J. Pitter, decades ago created a master plan, or a Budo created a master plan or a framework, or there's a pretty architectural rendering. It happened with people finding affordable spaces to start businesses. And I think at its core, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, what Budo's trying to do and what CP Planning is trying to do is allow for kind of self-autonomy, that in the end it's not Budo, it's not an architectural vision that's going to allow for Little Jamaica communities like it to thrive. It's kind of empowered residents taking up ownership, starting businesses, and the big question with that is affordability and how challenging it is. It's not 1960 today in Little Jamaica. From an architect perspective, I think a lot of challenges in planning do relate to zoning, is that we don't allow for a new Little Jamaica to occur. Which I think some of the things that Partner is addressing, that we're trying to address in our Venice Biennale. Why can't you open a barber shop in a garage where rent is less cheap than a main street? Or why can't you live in a back lane? So my personal perspective is, and again, I think I mentioned before, is allowing Little Jamaica to just be free to flourish on its own. And I think there's so many things, from zoning to policies to bureaucracies, when you sort of say, oh, you have to wait a year and a half, which is challenging for residents to hear that what you're doing isn't going to be that necessarily beneficial immediately. And I think, so that's, I think, yeah, the skepticism, I have that.
Yeah, and the overlay of urgency from a perspective of your rent lease is coming up. Where are the resources now to maintain my commercial space, for example? Or so there's the longevity, the long-term goal, and then the immediacy of retaining the community character, which is sort of somewhat at odds, and I think must be very challenging as part of the process. Yeah, that's great. Well, with that, I see another question. Yeah. Yes.
Well, my question is, and maybe because I'm sitting here wondering about two things. One is the thought about. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So, by the way, great presentations. Thank you. This is a really good discussion. But I did want to. I was sitting here thinking about the occupation of space for Black people. Like right now, I'm in a space, and I feel like everywhere in Toronto and pretty in the world is Black space when I'm there, right? And so I'm thinking about many people in this audience who are not Black, who are not even familiar with some of the spaces we're talking about that you're creating, and we need. It's important. So that bigger conversation, I'm wondering about how you see this connected to that larger conversation about, and it's really the history of colonization, right? And the idea of what it means for anybody here who are architects thinking about any space you're creating, and how you're thinking about even that question earlier about diversity and consultations in communities. And how do we build anywhere for people? And also, my friend here saying, we were talking about the idea of who has power. And there are lots of things that happened with zoning when COVID hit around how you could allow space to be used that benefited certain parts of the city that didn't benefit parts where people with less power were living, right? And occupying space. So I'm curious about how you see this connected to just that bigger conversation. And, I'm thinking about as an architect as well, if, there's opportunities to also bid on other kinds of projects where it's about the larger community and how we then think about the different peoples in that community. And that's why I'm really excited and appreciating how you talked about even Wildseed in relationship to the what am I saying here? Chinatown, right? And the proximities and how we think about our relationship to the wider community and indigenous peoples of this land as well. So that constant, bigger conversation about everywhere and anywhere is where we could end up. And we should feel when we walk into that we were expected or thought about, right? Because that's also interrupting the colonial idea of what space should look like and who it serves. Because I want to feel like I could go anywhere and feel all the things you talked about in that list, right? And then the other question, the other comment, sorry, I'm thinking I have a question, but it's another comment, but I want you to think up to, if you have any thoughts on it as well, is the idea of pre-colonial. So this notion of what it means to imagine space now for Black peoples and communities, that there has been parts of history that if we go back to the continent, the African continent, but also we imagine the world, Pangaea and all the world before that, of how we occupied space and thought about cities and communities. And I'm thinking when you said about the garage and those kinds of things, even just visually what it looks like, right? Because we imagine this idea of progress and modernity in a particular way, but I'm imagining about what it would be like to return to or engage with. And I'm wondering if in your practices you're doing some of that to look at other parts of the world, like you did in Jamaica, but also those histories of where Black people have anchors. So people from the continent who are probably sitting in this room thinking, but we're having those conversations where we are, and there's probably lots of benefits to who we are here because many of us are parts of diaspora connected to all those places. So just those two things, one, how we occupy wider space in this part of the world, but also that connection to our histories and pre-colonial times and imaginations in a more global aspect.
Deep question.
I can start. Thank you so much for that. Thank you. I think your first question around really just like taking a step back and thinking about the audience that we're sort of engaging with, and the context in which we're entering a conversation around Black space is really important to kind of like wrestle with a little bit, because the reality of like our sort of disciplinary sort of practices is that Black organizations, Black institutions, Black spaces are kind of perceived, are looked at with much higher levels of scrutiny than other spaces. Like, we know this. It's not only that we set higher benchmarks and standards for ourselves because we know that we want to support and engage with and approach our work in ways that that benefit our communities in meaningful ways, but the other side of it is that our work is kind of looked at under like a particular kind of microscope. So that's kind of just like an important curtain to unveil. Scrutiny is just something that we kind of have to deal with as Black organizations who are doing Black work. But to sort of engage with your other questions a little bit more deeply, what's been really helpful for us at Wildseed is thinking about not only the building as like a priority space to kind of engage a little bit more intentionally with, but also being really attentive to our landscape engagement and being much more meaningful around the conversations that we take up with Black and Indigenous creatives and land-based workers to use kind of like the landscape that we are offered at Wildseed as a space to kind of take up not only like land-based programming, but also land-based design in ways that sort of call back to Indigenous relations to land, Afro-Indigenous relations to land, and just spend more time unearthing it. That was not meant to be a pun, but like unearthing our relationship to land in really, really meaningful ways, because again, like we have a really unique opportunity to think beyond the confines of the construct that we sort of both made reference to, and we're not rushing that process at all. And then the third kind of conversations you had, or question that you were sort of wrestling with around inspiration of other spaces, something that's really beautiful, a site of inspiration that's been like really meaningful for me to kind of continue returning to, is this like legislative building in Mexico that was like completely burnt down and repurposed by Zapatistas. I think that like the way that activists approach relationships to space is like a really important anchor for us at Wildseed Centre and BLM Canada, and there are always opportunities for us to look at the relationships that Indigenous people across the world kind of approach the repurposing of space.
Thank you. I think with that, I would love to, close at this point and then continue the conversation in the hall or reception area. So again, I'd just like to thank you all, Jessica and Tura, for your time and for just sharing your work and your approach with us today. It's incredibly generous of you, and also I think very illuminating for everyone in the audience as well. So we're listening and learning, I think, together, which is exciting. I would also like to say thank you to our audience as well for your time tonight, and also to Clara James, who has been instrumental. Yes, thank you, Clara. Clara James is the coordinator of events at Daniels and the program supervisor of Building Black Success Through Design Mentorship, which I'll speak to in a bit as well as an upcoming event. But Clara, you've been so instrumental in guiding and forming and just conceiving of the Black Futures Month event series, and we're so incredibly grateful for that. I'd also like to thank our other collaborators, Dr. Jewel Amoa, Assistant Dean of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion with Daniels. Thank you, Jewel, for your work with the series as well. And finally, Otto Ojo, faculty member at Daniels as well. and studio director of Studio Vol. So thank you, Otto, again, for everything. So with that, I'd just like to promote very quickly, because I know everyone's probably anxious to join us for patties outside, the next event in this series of 3 events. The next Black Futures Month event will be happening online on February 15th at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time as part of the Building Black Success Through Design Mentorship Program. This is an opportunity for Daniel's students to showcase their work, which celebrates their Black identity, and for Black Daniel's faculty and Black practitioners to offer comments. Please stay tuned for more details on the Daniel's faculty website. Also, the next in-person event in the Daniel's Faculty Winter 2023 public program is titled Understanding and Predicting the Changing Environment in the Coming Decades, is coming up on Tuesday, February 7th at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time here in the main hall. And so finally, we would like to invite you all to continue the conversation over patties from Street Bites Toronto and other refreshments in the Students' Commons just through the door. And we hope to see you again, everyone, and have a great evening. So thank you again, and thank you to the panelists.